Hello and welcome to Boxing Tonight, Mirror Fighting's look ahead to this evening's fights. I'm Martin Dorman, joined by Rich Jones. Please do give the video a thumbs up. Please do subscribe to the channel. We are, of course, here to talk about one fight and one fight only tonight. It is Canelo Alvarez against Callum Smith. Rich, before we come to the fight itself, we should just take a moment to appreciate the fact that we have this fight at all, given the disruption we've had this year. It has been made at pretty short notice, but both guys look in tremendous shape, and it can only be a great way to end the year.
Yeah, it's a great way to end the year. Huge fight, and I think, if at the start of the year you were talking about potential opponents for Canelo, Callum Smith would have been right up there for me. Would have been the perfect choice, and I think we had that spell where we were talking about, there was all the stuff going on with his contract with sort of DAZN and, the premium opponents. And there were some opponents being talked about for Canelo that, wouldn't have really sort of whet the appetite too much. So to finally come through it and end up with this fight against Callum Smith is, it's a real treat for boxing fans at the end of the year. And can only be a good one, surely. It's it's a fascinating one. And it's a huge fight.
You're right. I mean, of course, maybe tomorrow morning we'll look back and say that was terrible. But what you've got, and what's strange actually, is that Callum Smith is the world champion in all of this. Of course, it is very much a Canelo-dominated promotion. He decided who he was going to fight. His name's first. I wonder if even he will walk second to the ring tonight. But it is Callum Smith's WBA World Super Middleweight title on the line, as well as a vacant WBC title, as well as the Ring Magazine title. So it really will crown the best super middleweight in the world. And credit to Canelo, to be fair, he broke away from DAZN, broke away from, well, he's back on DAZN, but contractually anyway, broke away from Golden Boy. And he really does pick the best opponents. You could say that he maybe cherry-picked Kovalev last year as a light heavyweight to win a world title, but let's be honest, he's gone up through the weight, so you can probably forgive him for that one. But if you're picking super middleweights, and he did choose Billy Joe Saunders at the start of the year, you cannot accuse Canelo of not going after the best.
No, absolutely. He's got an unbelievable resume. He's fought some big names. Obviously, he's had, some lesser names in there as well, like every boxer does. But, in the grand scheme of things, you can never accuse him of shying away from anyone too much. He's fought the best, and that's what makes his record so impressive and why he's sort of the biggest star of boxing, really. So, but I think that's an interesting one, really, isn't it? Is against Callum Smith. Where does Callum Smith rank? And I think, if he was to win tonight, you could certainly make a case that it's, one of the best wins on his record. It could be one of the toughest opponents he's faced, certainly at super middleweight. So it's going to be it's a real tough test. I think, there's a lot of unknowns going into it. A lot of question marks over, if Callum Smith can step up. It's obviously by far the toughest fight he's faced. So, we'll see what happens. I think it's going to be an interesting one in a lot of different ways.
You mentioned Canelo's record. The problem with Twitter, as we all know, in any walk of life, is that it's an echo chamber, and in boxing over fight week, you can convince yourself that something's going to happen, an upset is going to happen normally, based on what everybody's saying. And I'm not saying Callum Smith doesn't have a chance, not for 1 minute, but if you look at Callum Smith's record, George Grove is the best win by a country mile.
Yeah.
And George, of course, we'll talk about his injury and his preparations for that fight. Not to say it's not a good win, but beyond that, we really are struggling to find elite victories. And we saw against John Ryder last time out, I thought he lost that fight. He didn't look great. Now, that could just be because he wasn't really up for it. Maybe he had an off night because he wanted the big fights and didn't get them. But although people have talked themselves into backing Callum Smith to win this fight, I really feel like, for me anyway, it probably will be a step too far based on what we've seen so far.
Yeah, I think I do agree, but I think it's a case of like the known versus the unknown, isn't it? Obviously with Canelo, we know he's been in with the best. He stepped up against, big opponents. He's got some great wins on there. Whereas for Callum Smith, like you say, the George Groves win is his biggest win by a country mile. That was his biggest fight to date, and obviously he won that comfortably, put in a really good performance. But aside from that, we haven't really got it's all sort of potential, isn't it, with Callum Smith? He's obviously such a big super middleweight. He's got all the skills. He's got the whole skill set. You know, he's got all the tools to be an absolute superstar, but we haven't quite seen him in with the very best yet to prove it, minus the sort of George Groves win. So it's kind of, we haven't got much of a sample size to go off for Callum Smith. I think for a long time we've been talking about him as, you know, a star, but it's, yeah, he needs that sort of big win against someone like Canelo or someone in that sort of realm to kind of prove it and, yeah, kind of turn that potential into sort of substance, really, which is why it's such a big night for him. Because he hasn't really had too many of those fights so far.
Definitely, and of course, there's no better way to sort of have your breakout win, if you like, than against arguably, and most people's pound for pound number one. There's been a lot of talk about the size difference, the pictures in midweek when they had their face off. I think possibly a little bit of it. I mean, there's no doubt Callum Smith's much bigger, but some of the angles, it looked incredible just how much taller he was, towering over him. And it's, you know, we've seen Canelo come up through the weights. People were saying from Callum Smith's early fights, he might be a super middleweight now, but there's no way he stays there. He's a light heavyweight in the making. But he's never had to go up. He always makes weight. He always looks great. But I do wonder if perhaps the size difference is just being exaggerated a little bit. I mean, I would imagine that it feels like there'd be around about a 10-pound difference in the ring, which is not ludicrous. You know, we're not talking value of David Haye territory. And Canelo's faced taller fighters before, been absolutely fine against taller fighters before. But what it does gives Callum Smith a game plan, if you like. It would be silly of him, daft of him, not to use that size and reach advantage, at least in the early stages, to try and control the fight.
Yeah, definitely. I think first thing with Callum Smith and his weight is that it's testament to sort of the work he puts in, how professionally he is. Obviously, like outside of fight camps, the fact that, you know, he's able to sort of make the weight so easily. He's obviously, you know, keeps himself in tip-top shape, and it's incredible how he can keep making super middleweight seemingly so straightforward. But I think, interestingly, obviously everyone's going on about the size difference, and there's certainly, you know, traditionally you think that's a big advantage for Callum Smith. But I'm just intrigued to see how he approaches it, because obviously he looked quite sluggish against John Ryder. It wasn't his best performance, and I mean, I'm not for 1 minute comparing John Ryder to Canelo Alvarez, but in terms of, you know, the dimensions, the size, things like that, there's some similarities there, and Callum Smith obviously struggled against John Ryder. So I'm intrigued to see what he will have learned from that fight, what he will have taken from that, and whether he'll sort of put some new things into place when he comes up against Canelo to try and sort of really make use of that size advantage. And I think in a lot of ways, like you said, Canelo's been against taller fighters and not had many problems. You know, I don't think he's going to have too many issues with, you know, getting inside, you know, picking his shots. We saw him against Kovalev. He boxed well against Kovalev before he stopped him. So I think, yeah, it's obviously, you know, you'd expect it to be an advantage for Callum Smith, but he needs to sort of get the game plan right and put it into practice to actually make the most of that advantage. Because, like, for example, against John Ryder, he didn't really do that. So yeah, it's going to be an interesting one from that side as well.
And of course, it works both ways. John Ryder was very effective in what he did, and it is one thing to say someone should work to a game plan, but if the other guy doesn't let you do it, then it becomes that much harder. Interestingly, we just touched Gennady Golovkin, victorious last night, retained his middleweight title. Do you have any? Let's say Canelo comes through tonight. Do you have any interest in a third fight? Personally, I think it's probably. I'd rather not. I understand why Golovkin will desperately want revenge for a defeat and a draw, which he felt he won. But do we want to see that again? Because it would mean presumably Canelo coming down back to 160.
Yeah, I mean, we've seen worse things. I'm not desperately for example, I've got not got any desire to see Tyson Fury Deontay Wilder for a third time personally, which is like a similar situation, I suppose. Although obviously the second fight was a lot more conclusive there. I'm not quite. I don't feel that strongly about it. Like, if they were to come out and say, right, yeah, we've got Canelo Golovkin for the third time, I wouldn't be upset. You know, I'd obviously be interested in it. But there are fights out there I'd rather see. I think, for example, I'm really intrigued to see Billy Joe Saunders hopefully get that shot at Canelo that he was so close to getting earlier this year before the pandemic. You know, Eddie Hearn says that it was all done. It was about to be announced, and then coronavirus hit. I'd much prefer to see that. Maybe that's just the British side of me speaking, but I think there's a lot of there's a lot of good fighters around the weight. Billy Joe Saunders being the top example. Obviously, Callum Smith fighting tonight. There's a lot of good fighters around the weight that I'd like to see get their crack at Canelo, rather than seeing Golovkin in for a third time. And I just think, he looked good last night, I think, Golovkin, but I'm not convinced he's got many miles left in the clock to compete with Canelo for a third time, especially having not managed to quite get the nod the first couple of times. I think if they were to fight again, I think Canelo would win fairly comfortably, whereas I think there's some really good fights out there that I'd be much prefer to see, to be honest. I don't know what you think.
Yep, good point. Well made. I think Billy Joe is definitely, he may well have his own challenge in Andre before then, but I would certainly rather see that fight first, and he could give Canelo, I think, more problems than Callum Smith possibly. But that will be for another day. Tonight, of course, it is Smith, it is Canelo. What is your final prediction?
I think Callum Smith will probably come out the blocks quite quickly. I think he'll try and stamp his authority on things, but I think, as the fight wears on, Canelo has time to figure things out. I think he's experienced. I think he'll sort of come into his own. He'll probably, he's got a lot to aim at with Callum Smith's body. I think the body shots sort of might kind of take their toll, and I think Alvarez will kind of take control of the second half of the fight, maybe stop him quite late on, maybe win on points. But I think Smith will probably come out quite fast, but I think as the fight wears on, Canelo will probably have a little bit too much for him.
Yeah, I wouldn't tell anyone to not to back the stoppage, but for me, I think we might see all 12 rounds, but I think it will be Canelo who has his hand raised. That is all from us. I'll be back in the morning with George Groves, Declan Taylor for After the Bell. In the meantime, enjoy the fights.